The Constitutional Convention, Part 2. In this video, we are going to discuss a number of issues that the delegates faced as they worked together to craft a new plan of government for the United States of America. And so, as they took on this endeavor, they needed to make compromises with one another. And a compromise is a settlement or peaceful solution in which each side gives up some of its demands in order to reach an agreement. Simply put, it means you must give up something to get something in return. One issue that the Constitutional Convention needed to address was how should states be represented in the new government? Specifically, congressional representation. There were two competing plans amongst the delegates. The first plan was the Virginia Plan, which was proposed by Edmund Randolph and James Madison. This plan called for a strong federal government with three unique, specific branches. The Virginia Plan also included a two-house legislature, which we call bicameral. And in this plan, representation in this legislature would be based on the population of the state. So again, in the Virginia Plan, representation in Congress would be based on state population. Larger states would have more representation than smaller states. And so, as the diagram on the screen shows, a state like Massachusetts would have less delegates than a state like Virginia because of its total population. Now, smaller states were opposed to this plan, and they developed the New Jersey Plan, proposed by William Patterson. It also called for a strong federal government with three branches. The Virginia Plan included a one-house legislature, a unicameral legislature, and representation would be equal. It would not be based on state population, but that each state would get one vote in the legislature. So again, the New Jersey Plan was based in equal representation in Congress. Now, you have these two competing sides, and so there's this conflict. And what happens is Roger Sherman proposes the Connecticut Compromise, aka the Great Compromise. And the Connecticut Compromise included a two-house legislature, a bicameral legislature, and in one house, the lower house, also known as the House of Representatives, the number of representatives would be based on state population. The larger the state in terms of population, the more representation it would have. In the second house of Congress, also known as the upper house or the Senate, there would be 2 senators per state, equal representation. So both plans are put together in this Connecticut Compromise. One house in the legislature based on state population, another house equal representation, as the diagram says, right? In the Senate, 2 for each state. Rhode Island and Massachusetts would have the same amount as and Delaware and Virginia and New Jersey. They all have 2. In the House of Representatives, it's based on population. Well, Delaware would have 1, Virginia would have 10. Another issue that the delegates faced at the Constitutional Convention: should enslaved people be counted in the state population to determine representation in Congress? So, should enslaved people be counted towards the population? Northern states said no. They opposed the counting of enslaved people towards the population to determine representation in Congress. So northern states opposed this idea. There were even some delegates who spoke out against the practice of slavery and the slave trade. They wanted to abolish or end it. Governor Morris from Massachusetts called slavery a nefarious institution. He also said it was the curse of heaven in the states where it prevailed. All right, so there were some who spoke out strongly against slavery, the practice of slavery. So northern states opposed including enslaved people in the population. Southern states were for it. They supported the counting of enslaved people towards the population to determine representation in Congress. Many delegates from the Carolinas and Georgia threatened they're not even going to join the Union if the slave trade or slavery were abolished in the United States. And here's why. If you look at Georgia and Maryland and North Carolina, the southern states, South Carolina, Virginia, which is down here but you can't see, right? Virginia. Right? If you look at all of these, okay, look at the populations. 35% is enslaved people. 32% in Maryland of the population is enslaved people. 42% in South Carolina. 39% in Virginia. This is why southern states wanted enslaved people counted towards population, because it would greatly increase their representation in Congress. So the delegates agreed upon the 3/5 compromise. The 3/5 compromise included the counting of 3 out of every 5 enslaved people towards the population of the state. So it influenced determining the number of representatives in the House, and also influenced taxation. So again, the 3/5 compromise counted 3 out of every 5 enslaved people towards the total population. It also included a clause where Congress couldn't outlaw the international slave trade for 20 years. So this compromise protected the institution of slavery and kind of pushed the issue towards the future, which we are going to discuss later in class when we move towards the Civil War. And the last issue that the delegates at the Constitutional Convention needed to address: how should the chief executive, the president, be elected? Some delegates believed the president should be elected by popular vote. Those that opposed this idea were worried that the everyday citizen might not be informed enough to make a good decision. They might be uneducated. They might, because the country was large, that they might not have heard about the candidates. And so they were worried that the right person would not become president. On the opposite side, there were some delegates that believed the president should be selected by Congress. Those who opposed this idea were worried that it would tie the presidency too close to Congress, maybe leading to corruption or factions, and that their powers, the power of the president and the power of Congress, were meant to be separate, not twisted in this mingling of the election. Okay, so again, some delegates believed in popular vote, let the citizens decide. Some delegates supported this idea that Congress should select the president. And so a compromise needed to take place. And so they developed the Electoral College. And what the Electoral College is it is a temporary political body that is responsible for electing the president. Electors for each state. So the electors are those members of the Electoral College. Right? The electors for each state was determined by the number of representatives in Congress. And so the idea of the Electoral College is the people vote for the electors, and the electors vote for the president. So the people indirectly are voting for the president. Typically, the electors vote in the same way as the people did. So the electors of Ohio would vote for who the people of Ohio voted for, the most popular choice. Now, what's interesting early on is when the Electoral College voted, they would vote for the president, and they would also, they would vote for the president. Whoever came second place would become vice president. And we see this in the second presidency, where John Adams is the president and his rival, Thomas Jefferson, becomes the vice president. Right, so the Electoral College. It's a little confusing, a little challenging, okay? And it also means that sometimes the person who won the popular vote doesn't become the president. We saw that very recently with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And so, again, let me just review this as an example. Right? This is a modern day example. So you see 27 House of Representatives for New York, 2 senators, as we know, equal representation for New York. You add them up, that's 29 Electoral College votes that New York gets. South Dakota, they have 1 representative and 2 senators, so they have 3 Electoral College votes. Right, so that's how it's determined. It's determined by representatives and senators. You add that up, that's how many Electoral College votes each state gets. If you look at the map, let's look at Ohio, for example. Ohio, in the election of 1968, they had 26 electoral votes. They had 26 electors. And so the people voted for Nixon. The popular vote in Ohio was for Richard Nixon, the Republican. And so the electors all voted the same way. And we see that throughout the states. Okay? So this was a compromise that the people don't directly vote for the president. There's a separate body, political body, that votes for the president. All right, so this is compromise. So we talked about three compromises. The Connecticut Compromise, or the Great Compromise. All right, it's also known as the Great Compromise. The Three-Fifths Compromise, and then the Electoral College. Those are the three compromises that came out of the Constitutional Convention and ultimately led to the creation of the United States Constitution that we still have today.